Welcome, everyone, to the first session of Generation Analog 2024. I'm Shelly Jones, and today, for this session, we're going to be talking about actually playing the home. Our theme for this conference is home in general, and so this panel in particular is going to be looking at actual play. Just a reminder that our panelists have 15 minutes for their talk, and then at the end of all of the panelists, we'll have some time for Q&A. If you are here watching us live, please feel free to put those questions, any questions that you have in the Q&A box or over on our Discord. We can always keep our Discord conversation going. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and invite Austin Anderson to give his talk on Theorizing Homebrew, Homebrewing as White Geekdom, and Aabria Iyengar as Counternarrative.
Thank you so
Welcome,
much.
Austin.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for letting me present here. I'm super excited. I'm exactly 15 minutes. I'm going to get started right now. So Theorizing Homebrew. The word homebrew is never explicitly mentioned in the 5e core rule trilogy, but it's difficult to imagine any contemporary TTRPG play session without some element of homebrew. DMs can homebrew spells, subclasses, campaign settings, or simply be more lax about rules as written. D&D has a long-running and thriving homebrew culture, with AD&D encouraging players to, quote, add, create, extract, and extrapolate from the core rules set, while Chapter 9 of the 5e guide outlines a variety of customization options that have informed many DMs' optional rules, i.e. homebrews. One might even argue that D&D is itself a homebrew, given its origins as a variation of chainmail, and homebrewing has been given added TTRPG cultural legitimacy in recent years with the rise of popular actual plays like Critical Role and Dimension 20, with Matt Mercer's Blood Cleric subclass, to Brennan Lee Mulligan's Rolling with Emphasis, to Adventure Zone's Flaming, Poisoning, Raging Sword of Doom, serving as famous homebrew elements that have inspired many home game DMs to incorporate more ambitious and often unbalanced homebrew into their own games. TTRPGs might even be in the age of the homebrew, evidenced by the popularity of initially homebrewed systems like Pathfinder and the massive repository of homebrew elements listed on D&D Beyond, where, for example, there are over 500,000 homebrew magic items posted. Thus, game studies must theorize homebrew and the value systems informing its practice. This presentation seeks to do just that by first situating the concept of homebrew within the larger history of white geek masculinity embedded within hobby gaming culture. Second, offering a general taxonomy of homebrewing as a practice in TTRPGs. And finally, exploring the reception of Aabria Iyengar's 3 seasons of Dimension 20 as a case study of homebrew. So homebrew is a multivalent word. The word itself was first used in 1771 to refer to the brewing of alcoholic beverages at the home for personal consumption. It is now taken as a given that TTRPG's use of homebrew comes from this long-standing practice of homebrewing alcohol, yet I want to offer a second potential lineage of TTRPG homebrewing, hobby culture, and the Homebrew Computer Club. Since the 1940s, homebrew has been used to refer to homemade material designed by a user as an alternative or adjunct to a proprietary product. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, homebrewing gained cultural purchase among electronic hobbyists who began using the term to refer to the self-creation of ham radios, personal computers, and video games. A particularly notable group of homebrewers was the Homebrew Computer Club, a group of computer hobbyists who gathered in Menlo Park, California during the mid to late 1970s over their shared love of building microcomputers. This now legendary group of hobbyists laid the foundation for Silicon Valley, as members like Steve Wozniak, Bill Gates, and Adam Osborne would all go on to contribute to the early personal computer industry. In her authoritative study of the Homebrew Computer Club and their newsletter that reached a readership of over 1,000, Elizabeth Petrick found 4 rough themes emerged about the technology they built: their personal desire as users, practical concerns as hobbyists, influences and dynamics of this specific hobbyist community, and community values rooted largely in counterculture and hackers. I would argue that these elements all define the larger culture of homebrewing and TTRPGs, but this is not the only inheritance that TTRPG homebrewing has from the Homebrew Computer Club. In the Apple II age, Lena Nooney notes that the Homebrew Computer Club's existence was predicated on a, quote, set of mutually overlapping conditions surrounding work, leisure, gender, race, and class, and she aptly argues that participation in the hobbyist community hinged on certain socioeconomic advantages that intersected strongly with race and gender, end quote. While the Homebrew Computer Club was not exclusively white nor male, as video game pioneer Jerry Lawson and educational tech innovator Lisa Loop were members, the membership of the Homebrew Computer Club was dominated by white middle-class suburban men. In The Privilege of Play, Aaron Trammell tells the story of white masculinity amongst geeks through the history of hobby gaming, of which D&D is, of course, a prominent example. Tabletop gaming emerged amongst this broader hobbyist community, and Trammell persuasively argues, quote, the TTRPG's community suburban mindset was a holdover from segregationist policy and white flight, end quote. Thus, the early TTRPG community and the Homebrew Computer Club are quite literally cut from the same cloth. The fact that TTRPG homebrewing, an act of creative co-ownership with the game, comes from this larger legacy of white geek masculinity demands our attention. To run through a brief history of homebrewing as used within D&D, I've chosen to focus on the use with D&D because it has the largest player base and most paratextual materials available. We know that homebrewing as an action has been present since the inception of D&D, and Dragon Magazine, which ran from 1976 to 2012, provides us with insights into the use of the word homebrew in the TTRPG fan lexicon. 25 different issues of Dragon Magazine use the word homebrew, with the earliest mention coming in issue 39, published on July 1980. Additionally, the original owners of D&D, Tactical Studies Rules, actively encouraged players to publish their homebrew in the early years of D&D, and a vibrant community of homebrew ideas grew, especially online. Unfortunately, TSR began acting extremely draconian towards published homebrews, and they would threaten legal action against people who posted their homebrew materials online. As such, it is extremely difficult to find evidence of D&D homebrewing culture in the early years of the internet when they were owned by TSR. I've checked Internet Archive Wayback Machine to no avail, and if anyone has any ideas, please do share, and I'd be happy to do some more research on that. Wizards of the Coast purchased TSR in 1997 and established the Open Gaming License, the OGL, to allow third parties to create and publish homebrew materials, and is much easier to find information from 1997 onwards online. While outside the scope of this essay, I'm morally obligated to mention that WotC tried to alter the OGL in 2023 and rightly received a massive backlash for a blatantly creator-antagonistic decision. So please do not confuse this presentation as presenting WotC as anything other than the greedy corporate conglomerate that they are. With that out of the way, what we can verify is this. Within D&D online fan community, the word homebrew has been in popular usage since at least 2003, when the Wizards community boards hosted a discussion forum about Dragonlance, and a user mentioned homebrew. By August 2003, the Wizards community boards included a forum for homebrew campaign settings, and in 2005, WotC used homebrew to refer to a fan-made setting in online articles. The D&D Wiki created a fan-made digital repository of homebrew materials in November 2007, and since 2017, WotC has included a homebrew section on D&D Beyond. Homebrew has a long lineage in D&D and is thriving today. I would now like to offer a general theory as to why TTRPG players homebrew. While homebrewing can include creating your own settings or lore, I am principally interested in when people homebrew rules or anything that impacts dice rolls in some manner. I've chosen this distinction because all the evidence I can find online suggests that most home games occur in homebrew settings, and it is certainly true that most actual plays take place in homebrew worlds. There is thus little debate or controversy about using homebrew settings in a D&D game. However, homebrewing that impacts dice rolls is a decidedly different matter, as there are lively debates in the larger D&D community and actual play communities about the pros and cons of homebrewing mechanics or items. Thus far, I've determined 5 general types of homebrewing that are common in D&D games and commonly cited reasons for the materials. That is on the left, while the general taxonomy is on the right. This information was collected from dozens of YouTube videos, about 100 online posts, and then personal conversations with my own D&D groups and TTRPG friends. The first is banning spells, items, classes, races, or any other elements. The second is modifying these elements. The third is adding or creating a new version of these elements. The fourth is a general looseness around the rules. And the fifth is pulling in materials from other TTRPGs. These elements are, of course, not distinct from one another, and there is often overlap, but these are 5 of the consistent reasons why players and DMs cite adding homebrew elements to their game. And while homebrewing is incredibly common, not all types of homebrew are equally well received. I have found 3 general categories of responses to homebrewing elements, both in online discussions of home games and in actual plays. The first is a criticism for failing to adhere to the so-called purity of D&D. The second is a praise for the rule of cool. We liked this homebrew element because it made the game more fun or more enjoyable. And the final is a distinct strand that has really arisen in the last, I would say, decade or so in a very strong way, which is praise for addressing the social justice failings of D&D. While much can be said about each of these receptions, the final response is especially interesting to me because it appears to be an increasingly common way that homebrewing is conducted and celebrated. Homebrewing can be a way to diversify the value systems embedded within a TTRPG, which is incredibly important for D&D, given the obvious reasons that I don't need to go in here with all of you. Embracing homebrewing can trouble these elements while also pushing against the rules lawyer, who Stephen Daschle has argued is someone who relies on the symbolic and linguistic castable that reinforces masculine power. I thank you for the time. Throughout, though this thoughtful homebrewing provides an alternative, yet the expectation to homebrew can create its own problems, which becomes apparent when we look at the reception of homebrewing in actual plays. And so to close, I would like to briefly look at the differing receptions of the homebrew elements in Aabria Iyengar's runs on Dimension 20 in her 3 seasons, Misfits and Magic, A Court of Fey and Flowers, and Burrow's End. There will be very light system and mechanical spoilers for these 3 seasons, but I will not be delving into any story details outside of overarching themes that are readily apparent from watching the trailers. So click away if that is something that you don't want to hear. In Misfits and Magic, Iyengar includes multiple homebrew elements. Misfits is set in a universe deeply informed by Harry Potter, and the table plays Kids on Brooms with the added homebrew edition of the, quote, common fucking sense dice, which Aabria uses as a critique of the larger Harry Potter universe. A Court uses 5e and takes on Jane Austen-inspired Regency setting and includes many homebrew mechanics pulled from Good Society to explore the value systems of status and prestige, so common in Regency settings. Iyengar's homebrewing in this season was mostly positively received in the D20 fandom, both on the Discord, on the Reddits, and on the other discussion forums. Yet Burrow's End was interestingly much more tepidly received for her decisions and her different homebrew elements, because many viewers actually cited the lack of homebrewing in the game as a point of disappointment with her decision to use 5e for Burrow's End. There are many reasons that went to this factor, principally the 2023 OGL controversy, but it is notable that users so often claimed that Iyengar failed to substantively iterate on 5e, despite her stated intention to confront the colonial legacy of 5e with Burrow's End. I cannot help but think this disappointment stems in part from viewers being forced to confront the value systems embedded within 5e by the refusal to homebrew, and thus being disappointed with Iyengar not avoiding these issues through homebrewing, but embracing them by playing the game, quote unquote, straight. Thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation about how I'm trying to theorize how homebrew operates. As this research is still in progress, I really look forward to the ensuing discussion with you and these wonderful co-panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Austin. That was awesome. Yes, round of applause. The electronic hands are happening right now. Thank you so much. As we mentioned, all questions are going to be held for the end. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Carson Barnes to give her presentation, which is entitled Playing from Home, Working from Home, Actual Players' Relationship to Play as Labor. So welcome, Carson, and please feel free to take it away. Sorry.
Hi, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Sweet. Okay, thank you, Shelly. Austin, that was awesome. This is going to be a tough act to follow. Hopefully I can share my screen. Is this working, kind of? Wait, now I cannot figure out how to make it full screen.
Hit the slideshow, I think will work up at the top.
Wait. Hold on.
You're okay.
Sorry, technical difficulty.
You're all right. These things happen. Also, Austin finished a little early, so
Okay.
we built in tech time. Thank you, Austin.
Marvelous. Wait. Okay. Is
Perfect.
it working now? Wonderful.
Yes,
Thank
absolutely.
you. Okay.
Yeah, no problem, Austin. Or Carson, please take it away.
Okay. So playing from home, working from home, actual players' relationship to play as labor. Please forgive my very basic PowerPoint slide setup. It's a lot of Excel spreadsheet data, so get excited for that. But basically, in April of 2024, as part of an undergraduate research project through Auburn University's Department of English, I, with the help of my faculty mentor, Dr. M. Friedman, launched a survey on authorship and labor in tabletop role-playing games and actual plays. So the goal of this survey was to collect data that might illuminate how people involved in the TTRPG field view their own work, how they talk about it, how they present it to the world around them, in order to better understand how this growing industry understands itself as a whole. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to use the data collected by that survey to look at how the spheres of home and work may be understood in a field that's based primarily around play. Is there a difference in how people who consider themselves solely private home game players talk about TTRPG actual play versus people who are actual play creators of some kind? So around 1,700 survey participants submitted their responses as data, but there are two specific groups of survey respondents I'll be primarily looking at here. First, there are what I'm calling the home player respondents. So these respondents indicated that they do play private home games. They are not professional or paid GMs of any kind, and they are not involved in the creation or production of any actual play shows. And then there are the actual play creator respondents who indicated that they are involved in the creation and production of actual play shows in some capacity. So there were about 1,074 home player respondents and 465 actual play creator respondents for those two categorizations. So with these sample sizes in mind, let's move to this graph, which shows the percentage of each type of participant who indicated that these words applied to TTRPG actual play in their opinion. What's interesting to me here is that there isn't a majorly apparent disparity between how these two types of people think about actual play. So story is the most commonly indicated word for both home players and actual play creators, while intellectual property and industry are two of the least indicated words for both groups. So overall, we see a greater comfortableness with words that lean more creative, like story and art and fiction, than we do with words that might be considered more concerned with the industrial side of things. There we go. Okay. So then let's see how people feel about that industry association. Another question we asked in this survey was more personally direct to respondents. Do you consider yourself to be part of the TTRPG industry? And here we start to see these two groups differ in their responses a little bit. So the home players are relatively evenly split between the three options, which were yes, no, but I aspire to be part of that industry, and no, and I don't want to be part of that industry. So the home players answered about a third of them one way, about a little more than a third that they didn't want to be, and a little less than a third that they already consider themselves part of that industry. Meanwhile, the more actual play creators consider themselves part of the industry already, and we also see less of a resistance to the idea of inclusion in that industry overall, with only 15% indicating that they don't want to be considered part of that industry. And compare this to how the groups responded to the question, do you consider yourself to be part of a TTRPG community or communities, where by and far both groups answered yes, they do. So there's a difference between what we view as community and what we view as industry in this space. But where is that line? Where does a community become an industry? And when do you cross from hobbyist to professional? Is it about compensation? So let's look at just actual play creators for this one, since based on the parameters I set, we can assume that home players aren't receiving any type of compensation at all for their private home games. And I do want to note here that I know not all actual play creators are aiming to produce actual plays as a profession or on a professional level. Actual play can still be a hobby or personal endeavor for people. And as we can see here, 46% of actual play creator respondents indicated that they are not trying to make money on actual play. However, around 45% of respondents indicated that actual play was connected to their career goals, and 48% indicated that they are working to monetize their work in actual play. Notice that working to phrase, this is an aspirational goal, which can be compared to the meager 15% who indicated that they already do consider their work in actual play as an income stream. This can be related to a further question we asked about compensation for actual play creators' work, where nearly 83% of them indicated that they have volunteered their time for work in actual play to some extent. Only about 7% of them indicated their work in actual play was part of a full-time job, while 32% indicated that they have been paid a variable share of earnings, and about 25% indicated they've been paid a flat fee for their work. So I'm sure these numbers aren't like a big surprise to anyone familiar with TTRPG actual play. I'm sure if I had posed the question, do you think the majority of people in TTRPG actual play are being paid for their work? To you all at the beginning of this presentation, you would have been able to easily assume the conclusion that no, not a lot of people are being paid, or at least not consistently. But I do find it notable that so many people do aspire to be financially compensated for their work in actual play, or at least consider it connected to their career goals in some way. We can see a desire for professionalism there, for credibility, a desire for the labor they put into actual play to be viewed as more than just a hobby. Which brings me to another set of data from this survey, which might again seem obvious, but it still provides a nice numerical understanding of how this field has changed in the past few years. So our survey also asked actual play creators to indicate when they first began creating actual plays. And on this chart, you can see a pretty steady growth throughout the back half of the 2010s. And then we get to 2020 and we see this boom. So 171 of our respondents indicated they began working in actual play sometime during the 2-year period of 2020 and 2021. 171. When you add up all the respondents we had who indicated they began working in actual play sometime between 2009 and 2019, you get 170. So, based on the data from this survey, to equal the growth actual play saw from 2020 to 2021 alone, you have to cover a 10-year time period all the way back to 2009. Obviously, we can understand this massive boom in actual play as an effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, as the majority of actual play shows, as indicated by this survey as well, are recorded remotely. And again, I'm sure this isn't a major surprise to most people familiar with actual play already. However, I do think it's interesting to consider this boom with the framing of the actual play industry grew when people had to return home. Is this when that aspirational desire started really coming into play? Is this when we started seeing more people thinking about actual play as something professional they could do that connected to their career goals or as a developing industry? There's something a little bit ironic to the idea that actual play as an industry primarily takes shape in a time when people are locked inside their homes, and out of that is born this desire for professionalism and credibility. The concepts of home, work, and labor are probably always going to be enmeshed in some way in the field of actual play. But we are seeing a growing desire for professionalism in actual play, a growing aspiration to make income off of work in actual play or turn it into some kind of career. Even while there doesn't seem to be a widespread agreement on what qualifies someone to be considered a professional in this space, there is an obvious, there is an obvious aspiration growing in the way people talk about actual plays and the way they talk about home games that aren't recorded for an audience. These two categories are considered differently. The data collected from this survey do not offer answers to every question about how home is differentiated from work in the space of TTRPGs and actual play, but they do illuminate some of the ways in which people within this industry understand and talk about their work in 2024. And hopefully that knowledge will inspire further questions that can be developed and investigated and lend aid in those investigations. So thank you. I hope you all enjoyed looking at all of my data charts. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carson. No, we love data. Data is good. Because yeah, I mean, we'll talk about it afterwards, but yeah, I mean, it's very good to actually kind of see statistical data that is supporting like what a lot of people might think to be the case, but you know, that's based off of either hearsay or assumptions, so that the data is good and we appreciate that for sure. So next up, we have, I printed this way too small and I'm getting old. Okay, we have David Hall. Sorry, David. We have David Hall presenting Home Games, Actual Play, and the Historical Development of the Tableside Aesthetic. So David, feel free, and I'll just, while you're getting set up, I'm just gonna give one more shout out for, please feel free to put questions that you have for any of our panelists on this session in the Q&A on Zoom and or over in the Discord. All of our moderators over the next 2 days are going to be dual wielding essentially both spaces, so feel free to have conversations in both. David.
Thank you. Yeah, and I have to apologize up top. A storm deleted my PowerPoint slides, so it's gonna be radio for this one. And but I'll do my best. I'll be talking about radio, so it should be fine. All right. So, in the opening pages of Queer Phenomenology, and here I'd put up a big slide with the quote itself, but I'm just going to read it to you. In the opening pages of Queer Phenomenology, Sarah Ahmed begins with tables as orientation devices, a kind of physical, philosophical anchor point in, around, and out of which the bodily inhabitation of space and thought, or perhaps thought in space, begins. Making a place feel like home, she writes, is for me about being at my table. She describes that work of inhabiting a space as, quote, a process of becoming intimate with where one is, an intimacy that feels like inhabiting a secret room that is concealed from view of others. Loving one's home is not about being fixed into a place, but rather it is about becoming part of a space where one has expanded one's body, saturating the space with bodily matter, home as overflowing and flowing over. Ahmed's quote here will, unsurprisingly perhaps, serve as an orienting device for this presentation, a lodestone for the major concepts I'm interested in teasing out over the course of the next few minutes. I will attempt to chart out what I'm calling the tableside aesthetic. In the most distilled terms, I am claiming that D&D actual play shows attempt to foster a feeling of being at the table with the players, included in the intimate privacy of that space, such that the viewer feels at home with the performance. And I trace this aesthetic back to the intrusion into and then co-opting of the domestic space by an increasingly centralized media apparatus. And though one could discuss this process by beginning with the printing press, indeed potentially with writing itself, I will focus on the crisis as instantiated by the invention of radio as a mass medium. In particular, I will use Orson Welles' infamous, really, War of the Worlds broadcast alongside FDR's Fireside Chats to illustrate a through line with the McElroy family's cultivation of domesticity in and out of the adventure zone. And then I'll conclude with a discussion of Dimension 20's talkback show, Adventuring Party, as a queering of the aesthetic category I've laid out. All right, so radio, coming into maturity at the turn of the century, brought broad, non-local national news directly to the heart of the intimate privacy of the domestic space, while also centralizing the source of that distribution. At first, radio listening time was a specific time, a family event, a brief, invited intrusion of the outside world into the home, where it could then be mediated by the familial and the familiar. And then this was FDR's great innovation with the so-called fireside chats. He emphasized familiarity, common language, and a studied and practiced simplicity of style, such that each chat required a week of preparation and dozens of script drafts. In so doing, the chats reversed the polarity of the disjunct between national politics and domestic space. Rather than the family inviting the outside world into the privacy of the home, FDR invited the family to sit with him in his personal study, bring them into his own domestic sphere. Of course, the primary reason for the chats was to short circuit the newspaper industry's sustained attacks on the president as the Great Depression kicked into full swing. In other words, the intensely produced aesthetic veil of domesticity was designed not to comfort Americans, as the legend goes, but rather to seize control of the national narrative regarding his presidency and thereby maintain the power of his office. No surprise, then, to find that the speeches given by the fictional Secretary of the Interior in Orson Welles' 1938 radio adaptation of War of the Worlds were given in the style of FDR, despite network prohibitions against impersonations of the president. Now, it's easy to imagine that turning on the radio to hear, without context, what sounds to be FDR describing the alien invasion of the United States and the hopelessness of efforts to resist might incite the kind of mass panic ascribed to the broadcasts. Except that isn't what happened. Most researchers now agree that few members of the listening public had any delusion that the events described over the 40-minute runtime were real. Most in the US simply weren't listening, and of those that were, only a small portion called or wrote in with concerns about the broadcast. But what is true is that in the following days, there was an absolute firestorm of media attention to the event, largely predicated on newspapers using the incident to illustrate the inherent untrustworthiness of the radio medium in comparison to print. So the success of FDR's fireside chats in circumventing print media's control of the news was an existential threat. And the War of the Worlds broadcast, complete with its FDR impersonations, presented an opportunity for print media to strike back. But that being said, the broadcast should be understood as itself a critique of the centralization of news distribution caused by the ascendance of TV and radio in American lives. Wells himself seemed to think that the reaction of his audience was, in fact, exactly what his satire was meant to produce. So I'm going to quote him in a second, describing a conversation he had with H.G. Wells, who was the author of the original novel. What kind of excitement? Mr. H.G. Wells wants to know if the excitement wasn't the same kind of excitement that we extract from a practical joke, in which somebody puts a sheet over his head and says boo. I don't think anybody believes that the individual is a ghost, but we do scream and yell and rush down the hall. And that's just about what happened. The program was meant to disrupt, within an aesthetic space, the veneer of domesticity that accumulated on the radio as home object, and the carefully cultivated relationship between the American public and the government. In other words, to reveal broadcast as highly mediated, as an aesthetic object. So, in spite of Orson's efforts, the genie was, as it were, already out of the bottle. The fireside chats, among other moments, proved that the extension of the self into the home could be mediated, such that the self was extended out of the literal space of the home into the virtual space created as home. This tableside aesthetic has become more and more important across various modes of cultural production, from shows such as Bob Ross's The Joy of Painting or Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, to Taylor Swift's self-curation across lyrics, musical style, and social media, a kind of invitation. Nowhere is the tableside aesthetic more readily visible, though, than in the explosion of podcasts and live streams over the past decade, as access to the literal bedrooms of artists became available to millions. My Brother, and Me, properly referred to as Mabim Bam, is the flagship product of the McElroy family line, with Griffin, Travis, and Justin McElroy improvising comedic conversation out of various prompts and game show style segments. That comedy emerges from the familial relationship between the three. It works precisely on the level of the familiar, emphasizing the intuitive, comfortable comedic relationship between the three brothers and their ability to make each other laugh as brothers. The format, even the title, suggests an invitation into a private comedic space. the first-person perspective and grammatical ambiguity creating a sense of shared fraternal connection, not only between the brothers, but also with the audience. Unsurprising then that when the McElroys branched out into their actual play show, The Adventure Zone, they retained that deeply familiar aesthetic, going so far as to add their father, Clint McElroy, into the mix. Throughout the over 250 episodes, each somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes, the highly edited show nevertheless leaves in the many moments of confusion, mistakes, and of course comedic detours as the family inevitably becomes distracted over the course of play. There's a careful curation on display of the game as home game, of the players as family, of the play as organic or unprofessional. Where in other media we might decry a failure of professionalism or a lack of care, such as the infamous water bottle error in Game of Thrones being touted as an indicator of why the final season was so poor, sort of lack of care. In media that's utilizing a tableside aesthetic, these kinds of defects become constitutive of the experience itself. When, for instance, Clint forgets what spells he can cast as Merle, stumbling through the player's handbooks as his sons make fun of him, the feeling evoked is not embarrassment. The moment is not a disjunctive one. Instead, it's a moment where we laugh along, where we feel included into the domestic space of home play, but crucially, of their home and their play. And I chose Tableside because it usefully emphasizes the feeling of being included in the game, of literally having a seat at the table, which is a political metaphor we regularly employ as a kind of agentive feeling. Thinking back to the FDR example, the fireside chats circumvented print media by making listeners feel they'd been included in a process that would otherwise be inaccessible or unavailable. But of course, they weren't actually included. Listeners had even less access to the president than to the various newspaper editors, and they had as little insight into control over the processes of power and capital that defined their material conditions as ever. And that's precisely the point of attack framed by the War of the Worlds broadcast. The horrifying joke at the core of the broadcast is the listener's powerlessness over and distance from the events in question. If the broadcast were real, the listener would have no way of knowing, and it wouldn't matter anyways. Crucially, however, listeners do have agency with regards to creators such as the McElroys. Every year during the Max Fun Drive, Max Fun being the co-op podcast network they publish through, this is made abundantly clear by the intensity with which direct listener support is pursued. While it is true that listeners do not have a literal seat at the table, the existence of the table at all is dependent upon their continued support. It is in response to the disjunct between these two framings that the now infamous no bummers rule was put into place. It originates not in the very first live show performed by the McElroys, but rather the first live show wherein they allowed live unscreened questions from the audience. And the ramifications of this rule, as it has been picked up by the community, have been widely covered and across many sources, focused primarily on it being used as a catch-all cudgel with which fans shut down other fans who voice any criticism aimed at the McElroys, which is obviously most keenly felt by queer and non-white perspectives. But instead, I want to focus on the context, the originating moment, as a flashpoint of all the competing interests at play. The live question segment occurred as the capstone event for the Max Fun convention, an event designed to celebrate the audience as co-creators of the product. It functions as a literalization of the implied invitation to the audience, such that the audience could actually participate within the space of performance. But in order for that to be acceptable, the creators had to guard themselves in the space they'd created by establishing the rules the audience must follow if they're to exist within the space, hence, no bummers. The ambiguity therein is purposeful. Bummer becomes a catch-all term, a kind of negative aesthetic for anything outside the carefully crafted tableside aesthetic. Any intrusion into the domestic space that disrupts the sense of familiarity and ease. The two major bummer-coded topics being genuinely sad circumstances, such as grief over the loss of a loved one, or, of course, politics, another catch-all phrase with little inherent meaning. And it's not that politics as a subject is antithetical to the tableside aesthetic, but rather that the discussion or recognition of the tableside as itself a political space disrupts its status as domestic, which is, of course, in line with its development in the fireside chats. Obviously, the only subject discussed by FDR was the political situation of the moment. But that discussion happened within a created domestic space, which itself is not a political space and therefore not open to questions of veracity or participation. It'd be a much longer presentation to unpack the evacuation of politics from the domestic space, but suffice to say, much queer theory stems precisely from the recognition and disruption of the deep-set political implications of how a home is defined, policed, and of course, obfuscated as such. That being said, neither the tableside aesthetic nor the domestic space it emulates is in and of itself bad or insidious. Indeed, queering the domestic space is precisely where Ahmed begins in order to live out a politics of disorientation that gathers itself not around the inherited heteronormative order, but around queer objects. The gathering is still necessary. The table upon which those objects rest is still present, but it is disoriented within the queer domestic space. And that's precisely how Dimension 20's Adventuring Party attempts to subvert the potentially reactionary impulses that producing a tableside aesthetic might fall prey to. Far from suppressing or controlling the political implications of the artistic process they are participating in, those implications are expressed and explored, from Brennan and Allie's famous exchange that defines Brennan's activities as anti-capitalist, to Lou Wilson's statements on the importance of playing Black characters, to the whole cast of Misfits and Magic shouting, "Fuck J.K. Rowling," and continuously tearing into the racist, sexist, transphobic, generally reactionary politics that inform Harry Potter throughout the season. The cast opens Adventuring Party as a space for recognizing and articulating the always political project of art. The show is recognizably a space for and by a multiplicity of perspectives and bodies, a queered but nevertheless domestic space that models a kind of queer joy in gathering. That joy is simultaneous with, inextricable from, the radical political project of the show itself. Whether in Fantasy High's exploration of the ways in which contingent structures of power, such as capital, state, and religion, operate together to become naturalized within a population, or in Unsleeping City's attack on American political identity as increasingly capitulating to the failure of alterity and difference under neoliberal capitalism, Dimension 20 refutes the apolitical as a possibility. Instead, the assumption of an apolitical stance is always a facade that masks either an intentional erosion of people's ability to live as themselves or an unintentional participation in the processes by which that erosion takes place. That embrace of political being serves as the necessary grounds on which the show then constructs its own tableside aesthetic, not as an invitation into the comfortably apolitical safety of the domestic space, but rather into the joyfully political contingency of the queer domestic space. My hope is that the framework I've presented here will be useful as a tool for recognizing and analyzing what I see as a particularly important and pressing aesthetic mode in the current moment, and can help generate conversations that will push these new media experiments to become more queer, more radical, more active spaces. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. That was awesome. I think there's a couple of comments in the Discord looking for some like what your initial quote was. So if you can pop over there, just people are enraptured over in the Discord. Lots of good conversations happening over there. But I just didn't want you to miss that. Awesome. Thank you so much. So our last two panelists of this session is Nick Mizer and William White. And they are going to be presenting on the home group as center of calculation, the media ecology of local communities of play. And while we're getting that set up, just reminder for folks to please feel free to put things over in the Discord or for conversations after Nick and Bill's presentation right now. We're going to be having a good thorough conversation here. You'll feel free to ask questions that you have of any of our panelists so far, and same with panelists. You can feel free if things have been churning in your brains like they have with mine as I've been scribbling away questions. Feel free to ask questions of one another as well. So please feel free to take it away, Bill and Nick.
Thanks. This has been really cool. This is fascinating stuff. So as I said, or as Shelly said, we're going to be talking the home group as center of calculation, and we might even say centers of calculation here, because I think we ended up thinking about that as a concept in a few different ways as we move forward. But I want to kind of start with just an initial claim that I think is probably uncontroversial, but we want to draw attention to, and that's that it's groups, not individuals, that play role-playing games, with exception of solo role-playing games and journaling games and so forth. The basic unit of play is a social entity. And this is important because we often have questions about things like individual psychology and how we relate to different things, but we just want to draw attention in this presentation in our thinking to the group as the unit of study. And we see this in the frame analytic approaches that have shaped tabletop role-playing game studies. If we go back, to Gary Allen Fine and McKay developing Goffman's frames, we'll say that we have an inner frame that is inhabited as character, then the game frame that's inhabited as player. And so often in our discussion of that, we'll say, and then there's the social frame, which is a group of friends sitting around a table or whatever, and kind of move on. And so we want to draw attention and to some of the richness that's in that social frame and how it shapes all of the everything else that's going on there, and thinking about that. And we'll think about it from kind of two different perspectives here. In the first half of it, I'm going to take what we call an edict perspective. In anthropology and social sciences, edict perspectives are sort of this shorthand for outsider, even though I am obviously a gamer myself. In this, we're focusing on observable practices from an external perspective. And then in the second half, Bill's going to look at some emic qualitative insider perspective, players self-understanding kind of data that we have. And as is often always the case when you have these two modes of thinking, there's fraught and there's tension, and it doesn't line up exactly the same, but that's kind of by design in our approach here. So when we think about social organization of play, of that outer frame of social organization and play, we can think about it in all kinds of different dimensions that are worth drawing attention to as we think about our studies and our play. So play socially organized in space and in time, the kinds of social networks that exist there by the different roles, not all of which are marked gameplay roles, hosting, scheduling, all of these are social roles that people take on. And so I've kind of mapped some of that onto different kinds of social organizations. When we say it's groups that play, what are those units? So we can think of convention games versus home games, gaming clubs, and then actual play can kind of bounce all around here. But I think as we were just hearing, a lot of time actual play is strongly connected with that domestic kind of home game sort of feel. And if we look at these different kinds, we find that in our understanding in the history of role-playing game studies, it's not always equally represented these different kinds of groups. In other words, we've given some sorts of play more attention than others. And this isn't, I don't say this as critique of the history of role-playing game studies. In all of these works that I have here, the home game is the dominant, by a large margin, form of play in the times and places that these books are written. And this would apply for the most part to even my own book on role-playing games, as like focus on home games. But it's worth noting that, right? So the way we chose these, by the way, is these are, in case you haven't checked lately, these are the top 4 most cited games on Google, books on games on Google Scholar. Probably not surprising to those of you. I bet Shelly can see them on their shelf as they're trying to look right now. And there's some exceptions here. A creation of narrative and tabletop role-playing games has some convention play in it, but it's home game focused. Fine is really the only one who covers all of those bases. In some ways, that's temporally situated. And all of that is fine, but we just want to draw attention to it, because what happens is that home games become a sort of unmarked category. It's the water that we're swimming in without realizing it. And it's a culturally tinged water, right? Like when we say home group, we mean, in the context of all those studies I talked about, American late 20th century, early 21st century home groups. And it's not the only way to play, as we see in Fine's work with the Golden Brigade. I've done some work looking at Spanish gaming, which may be wildly out of date now, but there was a time in Spain where almost everyone was playing in game clubs that had like clubhouses and were doing parades, and they were socially engaged groups in a semi-public way. So just as I get ready to hand over to Bill here, just thinking about a few ways from an outsider analytic perspective, we can think about that, how the social organization of a home group shapes what happens inside it. So we have dense social ties. Everyone in a home group knows each other. That's not necessarily the case in other kinds of social organization. That can mean that the group is more rigid and potentially more liable to fracture, which shapes the kinds of play that you're wanting to do and willing to do in those spaces. Fine talks about at a gaming club, if you don't like what's happening at one table, you can wander over to a different table. And it's a sort of adaptive mode of both what kinds of games are being played and people coming and going that can be more adaptable and maybe open people up to different kinds of risk taking. We don't know because we haven't looked at it, I don't think, in robust enough ways in our scholarship thus far. But a home group also has more intimate relationships. You can look a lot of the trust that's required for sort of deep emotional work in gaming is dependent on home groups. And we want to think about those in different ways if we're imagining other social contexts of play. Because the last thing I want to say about the social organization of the home group shaping play is that the multivalent power dynamics. I talked about those different roles earlier. Often in the sort of unmarked category of a home group, you have a single person who is the convener of the game, the scheduler of the game, the host of the game, and has mechanical authority in some sort of dungeon master facilitator kind of way. And that's a stacking of power dynamics, and the specific shape of that social group shapes everything that happens in there. So when we look at the dysfunctions that can arise in home groups and how we approach those, it becomes important to keep in mind that we're talking in particular contexts. And then, so I've talked about a couple of ways that we talk about center of calculation for home groups. The very last one is just to mention briefly Bruno Latour's concept of center of calculation, where a home group is the formative base experience of most people for play. They learn their understanding of play from some kind of regular, sustained, semi-private group. And then they go out and have other experiences at conventions and other sorts of social organizations, or importantly, in actual play experiences where they are seeing, or at least thinking or being presented as seeing into those other domesticities, those other home groups. Their home group serves as a center of calculation for that as they process through. So I'm going to toss it over to Bill and think about how the social organizations come out in people's sort of life stories about games.
Thanks, Nick. So we'll move into this emic perspective that Nick mentioned, in the hopes that at the end we'll be able to create a derived edict. So we did interviews with what we're calling key informants, and you can see on the slide a sense of who they are in terms of their age range, in terms of their demographics. So these are the people that we talked to because of our sense that they were insiders, that they were folks who had some key information and some way of a specific angle or particular angle on role playing as a hobby, as an experience, and as a part of their lives. So I think that we can just say that they are insiders and have something to offer from that perspective. And so the lens that we use to look at the stories they told us, our semi-structured interviews, ask them about their lives in role playing. How did you get started? How did that move on? Tell me about your play now. And so we borrow from French semiotician A.J. Grimaud, his notion of the actantial mythical model, which is essentially a way of like Vladimir Propp and Joseph Campbell looking at the structures of narrative and applying some sort of analytic framework or functional framework to them. And so Grimaud's insight is that the hero of the narrative, the protagonist, is in search of or in pursuit of some object, aided by helpers, hindered by foes or adversaries. But that object, at the same time as it's the thing that they desire, the thing that the hero is after, is also in some sense a message from a sender to a receiver. It's not just an object of desire, but it's an object of communication. And so the way that those functions are divided in any particular narrative are the moral of the story and the shape of the narrative. So we use that to look at the stories that they told us. And I just want to talk about 3 of those narratives in order to sort of signal or see what emerges from them in terms of a generic narrative of the role player. So here's the first one, first of these three, and we're just looking at the generational patterns. And so we had one Gen Z narrative, and here it is. So what's interesting that in this sender category, they talk about the ad hoc online play group that sort of serves as a center for them. But the goal is, to find games that allow just like this free role play, as they said, and that are obscured by or hindered by what they called overwrought TVRPG systems and adversarial play cultures, and sort of to evoke that an experience or an image of a role-playing experience that they first had maybe in the 6th grade, and that they also see later in an actual play that they watched with some regularity and got into, and sort of see that as the community within which they are operating. A second perspective begins in a place that's not tabletop role-playing per se, but is fan forum role-playing related to a video game character, and that to a certain extent their adversary is the hinderer or foe is they're playing to and designing and contributing to role-playing as a hobby and as a field, in resistance to their 13-year-old self, who was able to game the system literally and play in a way that gave them an advantage that ultimately they felt was unfair. And so you can see that kind of messaging happening, in the sense that the goal of cultural euphoria, as deep, rich, complex societies and cultures and systems of meaning, to get at that is the object that they pursue in their play. And it emerges from a very early experience, reading through AD&D books and going, wow, there's something here, if I could just get to it. And then the last narrative that I want to point to is this Gen X narrative, an older guy who, again, going back to an experience in elementary school where he uses the phrase chasing the dragon, that gave him a taste of some experience that was so powerful and so rich that the goal becomes for him, to share those experiences, not telling stories, not doing any of that, but sharing experiences with my players, and then offering that in a larger community that they happen to mention in terms of convention panels that they talk to the audiences there who are seeking something that they see, in this case from, you mentioned Critical Role, other actual plays as a place where people get that taste and then want to have that experience in a particular way. And so if we look at these as kind of exemplars of a more generic narrative, I think it looks something like this, where you have the TRPG player pursuing a vision of play that's also a message that comes out of some early role-playing experience to a broader gaming audience, that's situated within the sort of center of calculation and is opposed or hindered by what I want to call inimical cultural elements, the sort of the playing it wrong or playing it or coming from a wrong perspective that isn't as open, as nurturing, as accepting as they think it could be. And so to a certain extent, I want to say every player is the hero of their own narrative, their own story of their life in role playing. And with just a few minutes left, I think I just want to offer these as findings, in the sense that that notion of cultural identity, I think, emerges quite powerfully. The notion that players recognize the culture of play or the play experience that's around them, the shift over time in terms of engagement with TRPGs is something that's worth noting as something that happens in the life course. And then finally, that notion of how the generational shifts in the media ecology, that is the surrounding media landscape in which you're located in, is something that is quite important, I think, to explore in understanding players and their play. So I use the phrase transmediation of fantasy to capture that. And Nick, you had said that you might have some comments or responses to that. So I would just want to throw the floor to Nick to say what he has to say. With about 1 minute left, I think.
With 1 minute left, I think just to, again, like I said at the beginning, to echo myself at the beginning of we have these two lenses, I think maybe giving some stereoscopic vision about this, that we can create these models like I did at the beginning, but then it shows up in all kinds of different ways for people, that these groups are like recurring and different groups are going to function in different ways to again, not valorize one kind of play or social organization or another, but to look at and draw attention to how the social side of it is shaping every other area in complicated ways that we see in the data here, and as we're building those narratives about our own understanding individually and as a community of games scholars, of game players, and we kind of imagine the whole history and forward motion of where we can go as we continue to imagine together.
Thank you, Nick.
That was a perfect way to end. Thank you so much, both of you. Yes, a round of applause for Nick and Bill. Wonderful. Okay, so now we have, up to, well, let's see. We have a break at 11. So yes, we have about a half hour for conversation, up to or less than, depending on how the conversation goes and how many questions people have. But just as people are, thinking about putting questions into our Q&A box, I want to thank all of our panelists one more time, because that was a great way to start off this, I almost said this semester's, like that's how my brain works, to start off this year's Generation Analog. So yes, thank you everyone. And if folks have questions, either from our audience or from our panelists, I know that there's been, there's clearly threads going through all of your conversations, and some of, a lot of this is ongoing research. So if there's questions that you have, please feel free to intervene. AKA shut me up. Thank you, Austin. Go for it.
I actually just want to say thank you so much, Shelly, for leading the panel. That's all I
Not
want
a
to
problem. Thanks. So one thing. Oops, go for it.
I have a question. So, and I guess this is for David and Cameron, I guess. Is it, did I get that right? Carson, I'm sorry. My bad. I can't read my
We're both in the bifocal age, right?
Just so.
You're good.
So I was interested, right, in the contrast between the very like the economic or the monetization aspirations in Carson's talk of actual play, and the contrast between that and David's emphasis on art and politics, right? And it feels like that's a tension. And I wonder if either of you would like to speak to exactly that tension, how it manifests itself, either in your data or in what you see, or in how you, in your analysis in some way. I mean, the tension between art and commerce, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, absolutely. This was definitely something I was thinking about as I was listening to Carson's presentation. What I think was interesting about it to me is that it didn't feel like there was much, that it didn't feel like a tension to me. It felt like a motivation for why this kind of aesthetic has been propagated, right? So in order to be a financially successful, somebody brought up the podcast that Brennan, Aabria, and Erica are doing, which is great, and obviously is doing this kind of Tableside aesthetic. Critical Role does it, right? All of the successful ones do it, and so it feels like the propagation of this aesthetic has a commercial economic basis to it, right? In order to be successful in this space, one must reproduce this kind of aesthetic. If you attempt to create like a highly professional, like everybody's always in character, everybody's constantly performing the role, it's not going to work. And it's not going to sell. At least that is the dominant feeling, and as a dominant feeling probably just is true in the sense of seeing that would then feel like a kind of disjunctive weird experience. So I think that it's interesting to think of the aesthetic that I'm talking about as having nothing really to do with the actual like professional. Well, I mean, nothing and everything to do with it, right? In order to be a professional, one must be so professional as to be able to convince people that one is not professional.
No, I agree with what David was saying, and it, it there is we had some data in the survey that was specifically related to like asking people what do you think like is acceptable revenue streams for actual plays for so like that type of data. Obviously I didn't include it, but with that you do see more like people saying that crowdfunding and audience support like are the most widely acceptable types of funding, with like paywall being the like least accepted type of funding broadly. So I think that like I definitely agree with what David was saying where it's like to be professional you have to like sort of be professional enough to appear not professional to be able to reproduce that like tableside aesthetic. And I think that like there is a sort of investment of the audience in that tableside aesthetic, and it's like those are the shows that are successful enough to be professional, and that people are sort of striving to be like are the ones that can sort of, I mean, to say they like can disguise themselves like sounds deceitful, but that they can produce an image. uh and I definitely think it's part of that negotiation.
Sure, it's the irony of authenticity kind of thing. Would you, like, how would you, uh, like, when I think about that, I go to like Baudrillard and the simulacra. Sorry, but the notion that the authentic is when the authentic is manufactured, then you go into like spirals of self-presentation, and the desire for authenticity then becomes its own I don't know, will-o-wisp, as it were. There's something there that's interesting, I think.
Yeah, and bouncing off of what Carson just said, it reminded me of something that I had to cut out of my originally like 4,000 word paper that just absolutely could not be presented, which was talking about Sam in Critical Role at the beginning of each episode doing his ad reads, right? And those being at the same time an incredibly profitable venture for Critical Role, necessary for creating the massive amount of income that show gets, but they are designed to feel kind of like makeshift, self-started, right? Like they have this feeling of like, oh, he just kind of thought of it on the fly. And I think that there is it's interesting to me to sense the kind of tension between, okay, this is a thing that is designed to generate huge amounts of profit from advertisers in addition to just getting it from the audience, but that aesthetic has to be maintained between those two things.
Yeah, they're belying the idea of being outright corporate, right? With the hokum, or like the idea of like, oh, we're just jokey, and the humor goes a long way to alleviate that tension of they're just like us, but they're getting a multi-million-dollar Amazon deal. That's just like us, right? Totally.
Exactly.
I wonder, Austin, one of the things that stood out to me in your talk is this idea of purity. This is like a construction of pure D&D. That seems like it's a connecting topic to authenticity. So what, like, the connection between authentic homebrewed actual play, it seems like from the analysis is that like there's an idea that some amount of homebrew is required for authenticity, but then that threatens purity, the construction of purity too.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And they somewhat run against each other. I'll point to Jacob in the Discord had put a question about some of this similar point, and he made a mention of like the feeling of that made me think about the requirement to homebrew, and one of the most common data points was that players or DMs, I would say specifically online, seem to cite that if you don't homebrew, you're not a proper DM because you're not creative enough, because you haven't you haven't added anything. You're just opening a module, and somehow that's like a failure to some degree, like a creative failure, a failure of imagination. But then you have this counterpoint where over and over again, especially on the more, I would say, maybe right-leaning spaces in the TTRPGs online communities, of pushing that boundaries of, again, of the things that affect dice rolls, because you never see this when people are talking about settings or anything anything that affects dice rolls that can be so-called overpowered or underpowered seems to be playing D&D wrong, or playing like your TTRPG wrong, and thus not authentically. And so those seem to be existing in this weird tension of the need to be creative enough to create your own thing, to do it right, but not break the mechanics too much, and thus no longer be authentically playing D&D. And I feel, again, Aabria at least mentioned in passing that that's the last thing I'll say, is that this is obviously overwhelmingly addressed towards people of color, women, queers, etc., who get that thrust onto them. I just wanted to mention that, but that's all. Sorry.
The thing that I'm reminded of, and I'm sorry to interject, is the notion of the authorized version, authorized D&D, going all the way back to Gary Gygax, right? Oh, what they're playing out in Caltech is not D&D, it's Dungeons and Beavers. That tells you something, right? And so there's the sense that there's authenticity, sure, but there's also authorization, and the authorization that comes from owning intellectual property. And that's something that is, I think, a quite powerful subtext that maybe needs to be brought into the foreground a little bit, right? Even the notion of homebrew, right, implies that, I was reminded of the old saying that, a language is a dialect with an army, right? So, an author, an official role-playing game is a homebrew with intellectual property rights, right? It's the same kind of thing. Because even in your talk, when you scratched it all the way down, right, it's like, oh, even D&D is a homebrew because it comes out of chainmail, right? And so there's the sense that, when you pick at it, or press at it in enough detail, the category disappears as a thing, right? It's all homebrews all the way down. And if it's all homebrews, then none of it's homebrew, right? And so there's a sense that it's an imposed category that's understood rather than something that emerges from, a natural phenomenon, right? It's an understanding.
Absolutely. It's that meme of the astronaut saying it was always homebrew all the time. That's very
exactly
much what we have.
So, but the notion of intellectual property rights is, I think, the central thing to sort of think about there.
Nick, please.
Yeah, I love this idea, Austin, of the people who, if you're playing out of the box, you're not homebrewing. If you haven't changed a rule, if you haven't changed a lore idea, intersecting with what we've been thinking about on the social frame level, we can imagine two home groups playing the exact same module with the exact same set of rules. But if we include, if you think of like in poker or something like that, people like, here are our house rules for playing poker. Or just coming over to someone's house at the host role. Here are the house rules. We take off our shoes, before we come in, or whatever it is. The baby's sleeping in the other room, so we have to play quietly. If we extend the idea of homebrewing to manipulations and modifications of the social frame that are outside of the rules of the game too, of like, oh, in our home game here, this is how we do it. We do this kind of ritual at the beginning where we share a cup of tea together, or we have a meal together, or we're eating these kinds of snacks. Thinking of that as a kind of homebrewing, I think, is getting my brain going, at least, of like, there's a lot of people who are really good facilitators of gameplay, and their skill is at that host role level is what we're experiencing, and like different flavors of different games. Part of what we're getting is different like hosting. And the intersection between of house rules and the domestic, like house feel, and house rules and the gameplay sphere. I don't know, it's getting my brain going. So I appreciate that example you threw in.
I'm reminded of, and I'm gonna let you speak. Levy Cornelson has a series of blog posts where he talks about GMing and GMing as design, and he says, oh, some of the best designers are GMs who have their 3-ring binder games. That is, they fill in the incomplete rules that need completion, and then it's just in their designer. So they design that. They call it D&D, and they don't give themselves credit for their work, right? And so the notion that it's impossible to play the rules as written, is something that emerges in the discourse of players and GMs, the expert player tradition, you might call it.
Absolutely. And I actually want to pull in both David and Carson here. I would love to hear in sort of this realm of this conversation that we're having. For Carson, I'm curious if any of your data points have looked at anything about house rules or like homebrew or anything of the sort, and what people's, and I'm particularly interested in, does that ever overlap with people's monetary goals? The people who have a goal to monetize this hobby in some way, do they feel a higher obligation to be more creating their own, whether that's systems or rules, etc.? And then David, I'd love to hear a bit about, you in our conversation, you always think about aesthetics in such a thoughtful way. And so what, and that you were talking about the tableside aesthetic, but maybe some of these discussions on the different types of aesthetics that emerge based on these changing rules, based on the changing homebrew rules, whether that's an actual play or just even in your opinion of gaming in general.
I'll say kind of in response to that. So with the survey, we didn't like frame a lot of questions around homebrew and home rules. But when William was talking about like intellectual property and stuff, it also did make me think about some of the other questions on the survey and the data points we were collecting, because we were like I was focused a little bit on like authorship and kind of how people in this sphere understand, the like authorship of the work they're doing in this sphere. So like in that sense, and with that being like tied to homebrew, there were some data there, but and like we basically like asked people like, do you consider yourself an author of the work you do in actual play? And most people I think answered like some of the time. But there was a significant section that answered like never, and then we asked those people like what makes you reject that title, and the most common response to that from the people who said they never consider themselves an author was that like their work is collaborative. So I think it's interesting to note that like this there seems to be a little bit of this perception of like, because of the collaborative nature, you maybe don't like have a claim on your own to what you're producing in an actual play. And we also asked some questions, like, do you own your work in actual play? Would you like to own your work in actual play? And most people answered that yes, they would. But we also saw people who do own their work, like own it in a collective. So there, I think the like collective and collaborative nature of these worlds definitely comes into play when we're sort of considering how like intellectual property and authorship is defined in these spaces.
Austin, could you reframe that question for me real quick, just to remind me where my brain was supposed to be going?
Of course. Of course. I think, and maybe I got to reframe it for myself. I think the question is rooted in these discussions of the creative co-ownership of homebrew, that in these modulations of the game itself. Do you see any sort of aesthetic practice emerging from the? I'm not super familiar with Adventure Zone, but from what I understand, they do a lot of homebrewing, from what I understand. And I'm curious if that impacts the aesthetic practice at all. Does that make it feel more of this like home aesthetic that you're arguing for? Is that basically a factor? And if so, in what ways?
I do think that one of the things I was thinking about is the way in which homebrew can often be phrased or framed as a kind of like anti-corporate activity of like, we are going to reject the sort of corporate nature of the thing that we have inherited, which is, you know, the D&D 5e framework, by just doing whatever the hell we want to do with it. I don't know that that really like holds as an argument carried through, but I do think that it is certainly part of how it gets framed, and sort of like you can hear that in the way that that creators will talk about it, of like they'll say we're homebrewing this and then follow it up with an almost anxious, and if you have a problem with that, I don't fucking care, like, because what, you know, why would you care about what 5e is? And it's like, it's interesting both that, yeah, there's a way in which that's right, but also where's that anxiety coming from, in terms of what is our relationship to the framework that we have is. Because I mean, to think about, I guess the way that I would think about this question is like, there's a deeper question here of how is our aesthetic practice informed by a rule set that we have been given, right? In the sense that like whatever we think of as the initiating logic or aesthetic of the rule set, whether or not we want to define there being one or not, it is true, it is nevertheless true that we are we have an aesthetic practice that is built on top of a framework that is not our own, in some like crucial sense. And I think that that is an anxiety for a lot of these creators who are thinking of themselves as artists, but doing a thing that most artists don't actually have to do, which is to say, taking a bunch of rules as the basis for their artistic practice. And I think that is absolutely an anxiety, because, like, yes, there's the entire history of like literature and art that one is working off of all the time, but it's different in the sense that it's not like when I go down to sit to write a novel, I have been given a 200-page book on the rules that define how to do novel.
It's
don't
actually
throw those out
strange
there,
to
but
me
you don't
that
have to do that. Yeah, Nick.
I was just gonna say, it's actually strange to me that theatrical director is not the model that just immediately comes in. Like, no one says like you're not an authentic Hamlet director if you don't reset it in a different time period. But it's also equally acceptable as a director to you know, people know that you're gonna riff on that. So this the metaphors that we use of like what other media we're comparing it to are important here too.
So I have a question that I kind of just want to throw out to everyone. And then there is Carson, there's a wonderful like reference or just another thought for you for your research in the Q&A that I just wanted to point your attention to. And then I think Bill is hopefully we can get to that question live, but I just wanted to ask. So I really like how we're starting off the idea of home as subversive, as this kind of place for experimentation and rule breaking, as opposed to the opposite of that, which is like the idea of the home being like safe and cozy, which we're going to get to tomorrow at the end. We're going to end with that idea tomorrow of the cozy, just because I don't know about you, but my brain needs something safe sometimes, especially in this day and age. But I was just wondering what it is about the home that creates this space for this kind of revolution, this idea of revolution beginning in the home, that we kind of need to like overthrow ourselves before we overthrow the world. And just wondering why the home for that, if any of you have any immediate reactions to that idea.
Oh yeah. That was like 2,000 of the words that I had to cut. Is thinking
Well,
about
I'm glad that we can bring it back so that
thinking about it.
your full
Yeah.
presentation is here, all 4,000 words of it.
No problem. But no, that like one of the things I was thinking about is what does it mean to bring like the idea that the initial sense of the political being in the world as being defined by local existence, right? As being defined by moving into public spaces and coordinating with people there around the local material issues of the community, and the way in which that changes once politics, right? This big ambiguous word becomes or comes into being as such, as a kind of centralized national thing that everybody is quote unquote participating in. And the home as a really interesting mediation spot for all of these issues, because the home is both not the outside public space in which news and organization happens, but it is also the place where you go if you're doing something actually radical, right? You don't perform your planning of radical revolutionary activity in the public space. You specifically do that in the safety of the domestic space as a place where that is outside of the public, like the controls that define how society is organized, because it is organized and protected by the sovereignty of domesticity, right? And that's why radical political action can take place there. And then to watch that like completely disappear, I think is fascinating, right? To watch that like simultaneously the public space as a place where politics happens dies, and the domestic space as a safe space for politics to foment. Those two things happen simultaneously, and so it's interesting to think about like what is the separation or non-separation of those two things. That's sort of where my mind went.
And I'll just again, this is just partially, this is just intellectual home. I mean, like so many other things, Black Studies did this much earlier than other parts of the Western sort of academy, and so I think that I put in the chat a Pauline Marshall article that talks about the aesthetics of the home in Black feminist praxis. But I think also you can think of particularly Black queer studies as being a long lineage that's troubling the home, the idea of the home, that TTRPG and actual play seem to be pulling, whether intentionally or unintentionally, from that legacy. I'll recommend an essay, Chandri Reddy's House, Homes, and Non-Identity, Paris is Burning, which argues that queers of color have long taken up the critical task of both remembering and rejecting the model of the home offered in the US by first attending to the ways it was defined over and against people of color, and second by extending the location and moments of that critique of the home to interrogate processes of group formation and self-formation from the experience of being expelled from your dwellings. And I think that's all quotes from the article. And I think that is a hopeful interlocutor with home in TTRPG culture, because it is so often people who feel alienated or isolated, even the suburban whites, from larger communities. And that pulling from that lineage and that legacy feels telling in both problematic ways, but also in really generative ways as well, that I think it's important to acknowledge and to think through how it's informing these practices.
Yeah, if I can like kind of jump in and like to build on and push a little bit on a thing that you said, David, of that it's true that you don't plan revolutions in the public sphere, but it's also equally true that you don't always plan them inside the domestic sphere either. And it kind of to tie to Austin's themes that you're tying into, I live right now in a neighborhood it's majority Black, historically Black neighborhood. And there's a group that was really important here called the Brothers. The Brothers formed. This is kind of in the Panthers era, but it was an adjacent organization. They formed in the basement of a nonprofit, the community space here, and so that's why, like, when I think about the potentials and thinking about the social organization of play, the thing that I get most excited about in terms of play that has revolutionary social potential is like club play, social organization play. Like I'm a member locally, it's not a game organized group, but a social club, a membership, democratically owned social club. A group of people go together and we bought a space, and we're figuring out what it means to like own this space together and create a non-capitalist social gathering place. And so thinking about that in terms of gameplay, that there is this other way that I think we just largely don't see right now, because the kind of gutting of small scale society, like you said, of like politics, meaning like my neighborhood and me acting together with other people in my neighborhood. It's one thing if I have a bunch of friends that don't live in my neighborhood come over and play with me. It's another if me and other people in my neighborhood are meeting at a space that we all have like shared ownership of, even if it's like a library or something like that. But I think that that's where the transformative relationship power gets me really excited, and it interacts with domestic things too. That like there's there's something like a give and take there, but
I'm just going to jump in and say I can't help but think about this club idea and then tying that to the cooperative authorship that Carson's data kind of was pointing to as well, that this idea of, well, it's collaborative, so therefore my ownership and authorship of it is not singular, right? It's not mine to own, but that it's this collaborative entity. Yeah. Oh, we're at 11 o'clock. Crap. So there are some more thoughts in the Q&A, although they're not necessarily a question, but David, there's something in there for you thinking specifically about traditional theater and working with a script and thinking about these about like what is legible and things of that nature. But it's at 11 o'clock and we are at our time. And we at Generation Analog really, really want to be respectful of our time, especially, and we built in big breaks because I don't know about you, but Zoom for 12 hours is a lot. So we specifically built in breaks for, you know, food and stretching and all of that good stuff. And we are at one of those breaks. So I just want to thank our wonderful panelists on this first session. One more time, a big hearty round of applause. And thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and I think stop the recording now. And then we can go ahead and do it again in a half hour, where in a half hour, I'll just give a quick plug. In a half hour, we will be looking at, Evan Torner will be moderating our wonderful, continuing this conversation, I guess, on home breaking. So first we were establishing the home and now we're breaking into it. So I think we've kind of been breaking into it this whole time, but that's all right. So yes, thank you all again so much.
Have a good break. Next presenters, just show up about 10 minutes before, and we will get tech sorted. Thanks, everyone. Great first session.